Happy Women in 1956, and it was given in Yiddish. It was then translated into Hebrew, and it was called Kol Dodi Dofek. I'll explain why in a minute. And then it was translated into English, and it was given the title Fate and Destiny. I've said this already in the past, but I haven't seen it written anywhere, but I would presume that the reason why it was given two different titles is because each title is focused on a different aspect of the essay, which is matim, which is suitable to the audience it was addressing. And I'll explain what I mean. What's the essay? What's Rav Soloveitchik's essay about? So the essay was really, in many ways, people will term it Rav Soloveitchik's Zionist manifesto. At the same time, it was also his response to the Holocaust and to the problem of evil. How can it be both? So the essay was composed of kind of three different sections. The first section, he speaks about the idea of suffering generally, of the problem of evil. And in that part of the essay, he focuses also on the book of Eov, on the book of Job. And that is, okay. There's no, for those, while I remember, I'm scared I'm going to forget, there's no class next week. It's Tanya Esther. Okay, just to remember. Okay, so those, so what does he begin with? He says that human beings, as people who live in a world in which we have suffering, in which we have pain, in which we face the problem of evil, there's two ways in which we can approach our existence. And he calls it an existence of fate and an existence of destiny, okay, which we're going to unpack in a minute. And in those two types of existence, there's two ways in which we respond to our suffering. The second part, and I'll explain again, we're going to unpack it in a minute. The second part of the essay, he takes the same framework and he expands it to the national, on the national level. And he says that as Jews, we are part of what he calls a covenant of fate and a covenant of destiny. Okay, in Hebrew, it's Goral and Ye'ud, a covenant of fate and a covenant of destiny. He then has a third part to the essay, which today we're not going to focus on at all. But the third part of the essay is what he calls the 7 knocks at the door. And he uses 7 knocks at the door, and he uses the idea, the metaphor of Shir HaShirim, of the Song of Songs, in which you have two lovers looking for each other. And they're searching and they can't find each other. And eventually they give up, or she gives up, and she goes home and she washes herself and showers herself and goes into her bed. And then there's a knock at the door. And don't forget, she's been searching for her lover all of this time, and she goes and she eventually goes to the door, opens the door. Oh, she doesn't open the door. Sorry. She says, shall I tarry? Shall I get my feet dirty? I've just wet. I've just showered myself. And eventually she goes to the door and he's disappeared. And Rav Soloveitchik uses that metaphor as the basis of what he calls the 7 knocks at the door of Zionism. And he goes through historically what those 7 knocks at the door are. And there's a whole list of what the 7 knocks are, one being the UN agreement plan and the white paper and all the various knocks at the door. And Rav Soloveitchik says that we as the Jewish people should be listening to the knock at the door and not leaving it too late to answer the call. Okay, and we should essentially be adopting upon ourselves the project of Zionism. Okay, that's the third part of the essay. That part of the essay we are not going to be looking at today. Now, that was the reason why the essay was called Kol Dodi Dofek. Where's Kol Dodi Dofek come from? Shir HaShirim, where the voice of my lover is knocking at the door. It's a very Zionist, it was very much the Zionist element of the paper, which made sense for the title to be Kol Dodi Dofek when it was translated into Hebrew. My argument is that why did they not call it My Lover's Knocking at the Door in English? And they called it instead Fate and Destiny, because the fate and destiny, the Ye'ud, the Goral and Ye'ud part, the fate and destiny part of the essay is not focused on the Zionism knocking at the door. It's not really palatable to an American audience. What was palatable to an American audience was the Holocaust element, was the problem of evil element, was the idea of fate and destiny. So that's an outline to the essay, okay? Now what I want to do is to really understand what he's talking about in the essay. And hopefully what we're going to do once we understand the basis of the essay and the outline of the essay and what the essay is talking about is to show you, what I want to show you is how it applies to the Purim story. And my argument is going to be that in many ways, the Purim story is exactly this movement from an existence or a covenant of fate to an existence or a covenant of destiny. The Purim story very much is a trajectory in which we move from a Goral type existence, from an existence in which everything is put upon us, fate is put upon us and there's nothing we can do about it, where we're passive actors, to an existence of destiny in which we are agents of our own destiny, in which we are agents of our own outcome. And in order to do that, so first and foremost, let's look at the essay. Firstly, one thing I want to make very clear here, Rav Soloveitchik wrote this in 1956. It was one of the first, in fact, I would probably say the first response from within the modern Orthodox world to the Holocaust. Until then, the only response really that had come out of any type of religious response had been the Haredi response. The Haredi response, especially within the Satmar community, had very much been a response of the classic idiom of divine reward and punishment, of divine retribution. We were being punished for the sins of the Zionists, and that was the reason why the Holocaust happened. That was the classic idiom that had come out until this moment. What Rav Soloveitchik does here is groundbreaking, and I want to make it very, very clear. It took another 20 years, no, another 10 years for more theological responses to come out. In 1966, Richard Rubenstein, who was a Reform rabbi, wrote a book called After Auschwitz. And in that book, he spoke about the idea of the death of God. He meets a pastor, Dean Gruber, a Christian pastor, who essentially says to him that the Jews were killed because they were God's chosen people, and that was what they needed to do. And Richard Rubenstein says, I cannot believe in such a God. How can such a God allow such things if we were truly his chosen nation? How could that be? And he rejects using Nietzschean language. He rejects the idea of God and says, God is dead. We don't need God anymore. He does say, Richard Rubenstein argues in a very postmodern move, that we need community and we need ritual and we need all the things that Judaism and religion offers in order to fill that vacuum of God. By the way, exactly what Nietzsche talks about as well. Now, what happens after Richard Rubenstein comes out in 1966 with his death of God theology is that we had the other theologians who until that moment didn't even have a language with which to speak about the Holocaust and the Shoah, didn't have a theological language. Richard Rubenstein opens up the floodgates. Firstly, he offers a language. He has opened the floodgates of being able to talk theologically and philosophically about the Holocaust. And then we have a plethora of responses. We have Emil Fackenheim, and we have Eliezer Berkovitz, and we have Yitz Greenberg, and there's many, many, many responses that come afterwards. So Hans Jonas, some within the Orthodox realm, some outside of the Orthodox realm, but there begins to be a theological and philosophical debate about the significance of the Holocaust, and in particular about the problem of evil related to the Holocaust. And then we really have more going on. But people forget that already in 1956, which is a full 10 years before Richard Rubenstein writes, Rav Soloveitchik had already spoken about a way in which to respond to the Holocaust. And what I want to suggest is, and if we look at it, we'll understand that it forms the basis to many that come after him. And today, when I teach, for example, Rabbi Sax's, we learned it together. Remember, we learned about the burning castle, Rabbi Sax's problem of evil. Rabbi Sax's, the way he responds to the problem of evil is based on Rav Soloveitchik's fate and destiny. I would argue even Eliezer Berkovitz's, which really became the kind of Eliezer Berkovitz's stance, became the stance of modern Orthodoxy, or the modern Orthodox stance in relation to the Holocaust after the Holocaust. Even Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz also adopts elements of Rav Soloveitchik. So really what we're seeing here is one of the first responses from within modern Orthodoxy that doesn't rely, and this is the key because this is what makes it so radical. People don't realize how radical it is. Doesn't rely or is not based on the classic idea of reward, divine reward and punishment. It is not based on the classic idea of divine retribution. Okay, and why? Because for Rav Soloveitchik, he understood that people, it just wouldn't have been palatable to people who had gone through the Holocaust or knew people that had gone through or lost people that had gone through the Holocaust. And he understood that religiously, we needed a different lens through which to look at the issue. And this is what he argues. First and foremost, he begins, as I said, on level one. Level one is that there are two different ways in which we respond to our suffering. And one he calls an existence of fate. And if you look, I've done you like a chart at the top before we even get to the text itself. We have what he calls a goral existence, an existence of fate. In an existence of fate, I am an object of other people's actions, meaning I am passive, I'm an object, things happen around me, and I really can't do anything about it. History is seen as a series of random things that happen. And what is the religious meaning in suffering? This is really the key. What is the religious meaning in suffering? Or what do people do? What question do people ask when suffering happens or evil happens to them? Why has this happened? The question of why. That is what he calls a goral existence. In a goral existence, I'm almost a pawn in a chessboard. I have no agency, I'm passive, okay? For a Yu'ud existence, an existence of destiny, it's a very, very different type of existence. There, I am an active subject. There, history is not just a random set of events, but it's something, it's within the arch of divine providence. It's something that happens as part of a larger, bigger picture. When I ask the question of why this has happened to me, rather than asking why, because very often, and this is what Rav Soloveitchik says, we will never know necessarily why. And therefore we get stuck with the question. He says, to what does this summon me? What shall I do? What can I do with my suffering? Now, what's absolutely fascinating is that social psychology has become, this tfisa, this outlook has become very, very popular in recent times, in the last few decades, in social psychology. And it's very much the tfisa that says, and by the way, also, I mean, you can hear here a little bit of Viktor Frankl and many other people, but it very much says, rather than focusing on the past, okay, you have CBT, and there's many, many different ways of, rather than focusing on the past, rather than being stuck in ruminations of the past, one needs to jump to the future. One needs to ask, how am I going to create meaning from this? How am I going to reframe my narrative? How am I going to move forward? And in many ways, this is exactly what Rav Soloveitchik is saying when he speaks about an existence of fate in which I am passive, in which everything happens around me, in which I am basically a pawn in a big chessboard and I have no agency. To understand that, yes, of course, there are some things that happen to us that are out of our control. All of us exist and all of us live in a life in which we have things that happen to us that we cannot control. However, Rav Soloveitchik argues there are always certain things we can control. And that is the realm of what he calls Ye'ud. That is the realm of what he calls destiny. And in that realm, I am a free agent in terms of creating my future, in terms of understanding how I can move forward. Then he takes it to the next level. And in the next level, actually, you know what? Before we get to the next level, let's just read let's read what I brought for you, how he describes the difference between an existence of fate and an existence of destiny. So it's in the box on the left-hand side, okay? Judaism has always distinguished between an existence of fate and an existence of destiny, between the I, which is the progeny of fate, and the I, which is the child of destiny. In this distinction lies hidden the Jewish doctrine of suffering, okay? Rav Soloveitchik is very clear. He turns around, he says, the Jewish doctrine of suffering is not necessarily what we would think it is. Hey, it's not necessarily in the idea of God meting out punishment for those that are bad and giving rewards to those that are good. Okay, and it's not even necessarily in the doctrine of, for example, we are human beings that don't understand anything and we just have to, go with the flow. Okay, no. This is what he says. He says, what is an existence of fate? It's an existence of duress in the nature of against your will, do you live out your life? Okay, and here he quotes Pirkei Avot. It is a pure, factual existence. One link in a mechanical chain, devoid of meaning, direction, purpose, but subject to the forces of the environment and to which the individual has been cast by providence without prior consultation. The eye of fate emerges as an object. As an object, he appears acted upon and not as an actor. Okay, so that is what Rav Soloveitchik terms a existence of fate. In an existence of fate, essentially, I really have very little by way of human agency, human freedom. Really, it's a total annulment of human freedom. Okay, I am simply just acted upon. Now what? Yeah.
Friend of mine said to me, let go and let God.
Right. I think I think there's a little bit of a difference there. I think it's quite different, actually.
Okay.
I tell you why. Let go and let God is a mindset whereby I surrender. Okay. I surrender to the knowledge that there's something bigger than myself, and that sometimes I do need to let go of control. But there I still maintain, I'm going according to what I think that she's saying. There I still maintain agency. In fact, the reason why I'm surrendering is because perhaps I've taken too much control and too much agency. Here, it's a total negation of my entire human makeup, or at least what we believe to be the Jewish tfisa, the Jewish outlook of human, which is that we are free-willed individuals and we can take control. Now, there's a very fine line. You brought up something important because there's a very, very fine line here. And I think this is what Rav Soloveitchik is saying. There's a very, very fine line between control, arrogancy, and hubris, right? Where I think that I can do everything, and there's, and total and utter submission and passiveness. There's a fine line between them. And I think what Rav Soloveitchik is trying to do here is, and again, the reason why he's also, don't forget, he takes it to one level up, he then takes it to the covenantal level, to the national level. But what I think Rav Soloveitchik is trying to do here is he's really very, very specifically addressing the idea of suffering, of human suffering. And he's saying, how do we respect? He's not here necessarily just talking about the idea of being free-willed individual and agency, which I think that relates to a little bit more. Here, he's really speaking about the idea of what happens when tragedy befalls me, what happens when, and one of the most common, or I should say the two most common reactions very often is to basically become totally incapacitated to the degree that I feel as if I have absolutely no control of my life. This fate has just happened to me and keeps happening to me, and I really can't do anything to change it. And what happens is I fall into very, very, I guess, strong, you call it in psychological terms, depression or passiveness or whatever it is. And Rav Soloveitchik saying there is, even though let go and let God, and Rav Soloveitchik believes in that. He believes that ultimately that, God is in control. But there is an area in which we don't, if there is an area in which we can take control of our lives, that doesn't mean putting explanations on everything and trying to fit everything into boxes. No, there's another way in which we can take control that doesn't have to let go of God, right? It doesn't, doesn't have to say God isn't there or God isn't controlling, but it also doesn't have to say that I have to be totally passive and surrender only to the fate that is thrown upon me. And that's what he calls an existence of destiny. So I would say it's something, it's a very nuanced position, but it's not exactly that. Fate, the existence of fate isn't exactly that. And this is what he says in the existence of destiny. So listen carefully, because it's very, again, it's very nuanced, but it's very, very strong. He says, what is the nature of an existence of destiny? It's an active mode of existence, one wherein man confronts the environment into which he was thrown, possessed of an understanding of his uniqueness, okay, of his special worth, of his freedom, and of his ability to struggle with his external circumstances, and this is the key, without forfeiting either his independence or his selfhood. Okay, so what Rav Soloveitchik is saying here is there are certain external circumstances and conditions upon which we have no control. And yet, in order not to forfeit our very selfhood, our very sense of self and our independence, we need to act in a certain way. And what does that mean? The motto of the Eye of Destiny is, and here again, he brings B'kei Avot, but he brings the last part. Against your will, you are born. Against your will, you die. But you live of your own free will. Yes, says Rav Soloveitchik, man is born like an object, dies like an object. We have no control when we're born and what circumstances we're born into. We have no control when we die. However, but possesses the ability to live like a subject, like a creator, an innovator who can impress his own individual seal upon his life and can extricate himself from a mechanical type of existence and enter into a creative, active mode of being. According to Judaism, man's mission in his world is to turn fate into destiny, an existence that is passive and influenced to an existence that is active, influential, an existence of compulsion, perplexity, and speechlessness to an existence full of will and initiative. The blessing of the Holy One to his creation fully defines man's role. Be fruitful and multiply, replenish the earth and subjugate it under your control. If you do not rule over it, it will enslave you, meaning the natural forces of the world, okay? Destiny bestows on man a new status in God's world. It bestows on man a royal crown and he becomes God's partner in the work of creation. And again, here we begin, what was that? Yeah, you totally can hear sax, 100%, and I'm glad that you can, because that was one of the points of doing this class, right, on Purim, is that you can already see what he's saying. And what is it? It's covenant. He's saying covenantal living, in a sense, is let go, let God. Let go, let God. I like that bitui. I like that expression, so I keep coming back to it, right? It is, in a sense, let go, let God, but it's also not 100%, because it's saying to us, we understand that as human beings, there are certain things that we have to let go, right? That we don't have control over. And yet, God invites us, because we are free, because we're born free, not like animals. We don't go after our immediate desires. We know how to repress our immediate gratification for something long term. We know how to be free, right? Because of that, we have the ability to lead an existence of destiny and not just an existence of fate. Now, what Rav Soloveitchik does is he takes it one level up. Okay, and he says it's not just about the way in which I was. By the way, I should continue here because he continues, but I haven't brought it to you. He very much speaks about the idea of suffering, and he says that when we suffer, and he brings in the book of Eov, and he says that Eov very much is someone at the beginning. What we see is he is basically an existence of fate. Everything seems to happen to him, and he is an object to all of this suffering. And eventually he turns around. There's a shift that happens. He becomes really much more an object, a subject of his suffering. But very often when suffering happens to us, and by the way, it's super interesting because Rav Soloveitchik generally, he works in dialectical, he brings two different models and he creates a dialectical tension between them. And then he talks about the idea of oscillation between the two different points. In this essay, he does not do that. In this essay, he talks about the movement from an existence of fate to an existence of destiny. There's a trajectory here, not an oscillation. And why is that? Because it's very simple. When a terrible fate or a terrible tragedy or a terrible suffering is brought upon us, our first response is very, very much one that is an existence of fate. We ask the why question. We feel as if we have no control of our reality. We feel as if this is the fate that's been blown, the blows of the fate that has been given to us, and there's nothing we can do. And we feel very much passive. We feel very much that we cannot break out of that existence. And Rav Soloveitchik invites us to look at it differently and say, after we have gone through that immediate shock and that immediate fall and that immediate feeling of not being in control and uncertainty, then we need to move to what he calls an existence of destiny. And an existence of destiny is where I am able to reframe the way I look at my reality and understand, yes, there's certain conditions I can't control, but there's certain things I can. And one of those is to make myself, or to reframe myself as a creator of my own destiny, to see my reality different, to ask, what does this call me to do? What does this ask me to do?
What's incredible, you dedicated it to the two brothers that were murdered yesterday. Within hours of that happening, their mother stood up and said, "We will do this, we will do that." I was astounded by that. Almost immediate reaction.
Wow.
And
grandfather. Wow. Like, talk about grabbing, understanding destiny and immediately, having that response, or almost immediately.
It's and again, for some people it takes much longer, and sometimes never. And this is what Rav Soloveitchik was really talking about. So it's beautiful what you said. So then he takes it to the idea of the national, and here we begin to get into the Holocaust, his Holocaust theology.
Where was the national? I heard a meaningful minute this week. I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the speaker. He said, like, some people think that like these things happen to special people, and she said it's the other way around. If it happens to regular people, and then they become special.
Yeah, beautiful. It's a very, very difficult topic, and I think one thing I will say is that I think that one of the, I've said this always, that to me the first narrative in the Torah that really grapples with this issue is the narrative of Cain and Hevel. And where, Cain, everything, he's born with a silver spoon in his mouth, everything's gone his way, everything sits exactly how he wants it, there's no uncertainty, he carries on his family business, etc., etc. And then all of a sudden he has to face adversity, and it sounds like ridiculous. Okay, God lifted up your brother's sacrifice and didn't lift
you know what?
what?
I was able to get
someone
on
like
this
Cain,
time.
that was the biggest tragedy.
I was
How could it
trying.
be? He was the
trying
one that
and
brought
trying,
he was the one that brought the sacrifice. It was his idea. His brother followed suit. Why should God show favor to his brother and not to him? And he cannot cope with the adversity that creates, or with the suffering that creates within him. And God turns around to him and says, "In tetiv se'et, if you make good, you will be lifted, or you will lift up, or your sacrifice will be lifted. Ve'im lo tetiv lefetach hatat rovetz, and if you don't make good, sin will always crouch at your door." It is much easier to be the victim. Much easier to play the victim. And unfortunately, in today's society, we see that in group, not just in individuals. We see that much more in group dynamics, that you have the group victim that wants the rights and deserves this and wants people to constantly think of them as a victim. And victimhood is, Rabbi Sachs has a very good definition. There's victimization is what comes from the outside, right? That you are the victim of something, but victimhood comes from the inside. And what Rabbi Soloveitchik, and by the way, that what God says to Cain, to me is one of I think it's the hardest command in the Bible of all the commandments. Make good of a non-good reality. Make good of an adversarial situation. Try telling that to someone who's lost lo aleinu, a child, or someone who's gone through immense suffering, or whatever. I can go through a million lists of things. Try saying to them, make good of your situation. It is the most difficult to wake up every single morning and reframe your reality and take agency of your life and go forward and be a creator. And what Rav, it's almost impossible. And we saw the Holocaust victims did do it. It came at a sacrifice, which was that they never looked backwards. And when, unfortunately, later in life, when they stopped and they did look backwards, a lot of them, some committed suicide, a lot of them went into deep depression. Okay, so I'm saying it's not simple. But Rav Soloveitchik says that this is the only way of responding to our suffering. Okay, and look what he now speaks about in terms of the covenant of the national. He says like this, a Brit Goral, a covenant of fate, is biblically represented by the Exodus. What does that mean? Covenant of fate, I'm looking on the left-hand side above the box. I'm not reading it yet. Above the box, I have there the definition. So there's Brit Goral. Can you see?
Yeah.
Okay. So there, Rav Soloveitchik says that, and again, those of you that are in my class will recognize this already, right? Rav Soloveitchik says that a covenant of fate means that I am part of the Jewish people, right? But I'm born into the Jewish people. Ein brera, there's no choice, right? That's the conditions in which I'm born. I'm part of the Jewish people. And when another Jew suffers somewhere else, I feel it. Okay, and when Jews are successful somewhere, I feel it. I'm part of a thin connection of people. That is what he calls and he represents it by the Exodus. When they came out of Egypt, God took them out. They were part of the Jewish people. They got redeemed. He also uses the Holocaust and the state of Israel, both of which, okay, are events in which, especially the Holocaust, right, is an event in which if your grandparent was Jewish, you went into the camps. You didn't have control over that situation. So that's a covenant of Goral, of fate.
I don't see how the state of Israel. That was a choice.
What he speaks about there specifically, if I'm not mistaken, I have to go back and have a look properly, but what he speaks about there is not the creation of the state of Israel, but the moment in which the state of Israel, the existence of the state of Israel and the connection that even Jews in the diaspora and whatever feel that thin connection to the Jews in Israel. So for example, this was done in 1956, but I would say like the 1948 war, where the Jews in the diaspora felt, an underlying connection to the Jews in Israel. Again, not in an active way, but in a passive way. Okay.
Not the creation.
No, he's not specifically not talking about the creation of the state of Israel. He's talking about the underlying thin lines of connection that we feel between Jews. Okay. The existence of and the connection. For example, we always laugh whenever we go abroad on holiday. Like you can tell, you're always looking who's Jewish, who's Israeli, who's, you're like that and that doesn't define anything, but you feel some kind, even if, you feel some kind of connection. That's what he's talking about. Brit Ye'ud, the covenant of destiny, is what he says is biblically represented by Sinai. Why? Because number one, it's consent. And again, we can argue, was Sinai really consensual or not consensual? It's a whole big argument. And according to the rabbis, it wasn't consensual because the mountain was held over the head. We're going to bring that a bit later on. Okay. But essentially what Rav Soloveitchik is saying, that the Brit of Sinai gives them a thick, sometimes there's this idea of thin and thick morality. Thin morality is like the very, very basic moral laws, and thick, complex morality is you have a whole moral system, a whole web of moral laws. I would call it thin and thick connection. Thin connection is the Brit Goral. That is, okay, I'm a Jew, you're a Jew, very nice, right? Oh, we share a history, how lovely. But thick connection is that we share a complex web of not just connection, but laws that tie us all together, rituals that tie us all together, deep and long history and tradition that tie us all together, mission, purpose, halakha. For Rav Soloveitchik, that was halakha. That was the purpose of the Jewish people. That was the mission of the Jewish people. And that's represented by Sinai. And he says it summons them to a life of choice and active shaping of their history. So now look at this right-hand side of the box. I'm going to read you what Rav Soloveitchik says specifically about the next level, about the level of covenant. Just as Judaism distinguished fate from destiny in the realm of personal individuality, so it also differentiated between these two concepts in the sphere of our national historical existence. The individual is tethered to his nation with bonds of fate and chains of destiny. Okay, now again, I always found it almost antithetical, what he says here, right? Bonds of fate and chains of destiny. It really should be chains of fate and bonds of destiny, right? I don't know why he wrote it that way. I still don't have an answer. I find it very strange. In light of this supposition, one can say that the covenant of Egypt was the covenant of fate, and the covenant of Sinai was that of destiny. What is the covenant of fate? Fate signifies in the life of the nation, as it does in the life of the individual, an existence of compulsion. A strange compulsive force compresses all individuals into one unit. The individual is subject and subjugated against his will to the national fate and destiny. What is a covenant of destiny? In the life of the people, as in the life of the individual, destiny signifies an existence chosen with its free will and which it finds the full realization of its historical existence. Instead of a passive, unchangeable existence into which the nation is thrust, the existence of destiny manifests itself as an active experience full of purpose, movement, ascension, yearning, and fulfillment. Destiny is the font out of which flows the unique self-elevation of the nation and the unending stream of divine inspiration, which will not run dry so long as the path of people is set out by the laws of God. Look at Rav Soloveitchik, very specific. What creates the covenant of destiny is the halakha. Now, those of you that have been with me in Rabbi Sachs, you'll know that he stretches it. For Rabbi Sachs, when he talks about covenant of fate and covenant of destiny, or destiny and fate, he doesn't even always use the idea. He very much speaks about the mission, the purpose, the goal. He doesn't always speak about it in terms of the law, okay? But Rabbi Soloveitchik, it's super important that it's halakha. Hold on one second, let me just finish the last sentence. The life of destiny is a choice-directed life, the result of conscious direction and free will. Okay, so really for him, halakha, and this is, by the way, sits very, very firmly with Rav Soloveitchik's general outlook on halakha, which is that halakha is not about coercion. It's not about being compelled to keep the law. On the contrary, halakha makes us creative individuals. And that's why it sits hand in hand, because to be a covenant of destiny, to be a people with a covenant of destiny means to be creative individuals in creating the law relevant for each time.
The chains. I'll find it now. Is he referring there to the chains of halakha, that everything you do is?
No, because I don't think so. And I tell you why, because for him, halakha is not about the chains. That's exactly the point. For him, halakha, and it's what I think is very, very important. Halakha is very much the idea that it creates, in Donald Winnicott's language, the creative apperception, right? It really nurtures our creative capacity as human individuals and our free will and our free minds. And that, read Halachic Man. Halachic Man is the most free agent, right? And halakha allows you to be the freest of all individuals in your creative capacity of halakha. So I don't think that would necessarily be.
Would halakha be sort of a continuation of Sinai as a covenant, that by accepting halakha, we're accepting
100%. And again, let's not forget, when he talks here about the idea of human freedom and human agency, he's not talking about it in a postmodern language. He's not saying that we have no chains and no ties and we can be whoever we are. No, his notion of creativity is very modern. His notion of freedom is very modern, which means what? Which means that I have certain things I am tied to. I am tied to the covenant of fate. I am born into the Jewish people. I have certain things in which there's certain elements of my being that I cannot change. In the same way, there are certain a priori elements of halakha that are non-changeable. Those are things that remain, that cannot be changed. The job of the halachic man is to work within the boundaries of those a priori concepts and to apply them instrumentally down here on earth using our creative apperception. That's what Rav Soloveitchik talks about. So again, the concept of freedom, the concept of agency, the concept of destiny for Rav Soloveitchik is not postmodern. I want to be very clear about that. Okay, he's not coming in saying we can be whatever we want to be and do whatever we want to do, and we have nothing that ties us, and there's nothing that we have to be loyal to. No, On the contrary, and that's why there's a movement of fate from fate to destiny. It's not that the covenant of fate, by the way, is bad for Rav Soloveitchik. I want to be very clear here. It's not that the covenant of fate is something terrible. It's just that if it's only the covenant of fate, and if we only see the world through the lens of fatalism, and this is what now we're going to get to the Purim story in Amalek. Amalek was all about the idea of fate. The kerchacha b'derech, he chanced upon you on the way. Good, that's for another time. The kercha b'derech, chanced upon you on the way, right? Pur, what's the idea of Pur? Purim, why is Purim called Purim? Exactly, it's a lot. It's fate, it's chance, okay? A chance meeting, that's what Amalek represented. And Judaism is the counter narrative to the Amalekian philosophy. When we speak about the idea of destroying Amalek, we're not talking necessarily about the idea of genocide of a particular nation. We are talking about the annulment of a certain way, a certain outlook in life. And that is the outlook of fate only. Okay? And that's what I want to try and understand.
Does he think that there are people who cannot progress beyond faith?
Of course, there's people that cannot progress beyond faith.
But it's the choice of each individual, or it's the way the person is.
No, it's a choice. Of course, it's a choice. He believes that we are all born with the ability to move from fate to destiny. The question is, can one do it? Does one understand how to do it? Does one understand conceptually that you're able to? Listen, for many, many, many centuries, people believe, even today, we have what's called, Rabbi Sachs speaks about this a lot, that Dafka modernity with all its rhetoric of freedom and liberalism and everything else, he says that you have scientific Darwinism, for example, which is very fate-oriented. We are born with certain DNA, there's things we cannot change, right? We can't change. He speaks about the idea of humanistic psychology, Freud, we're born with a certain nature and conditions and we can't escape it. Marx, for example, economic and political and our political situation defines us, right? Even though we think that modernity brought us freedom, actually in many, many ways it didn't. It made us even more fatalistic, almost like the Greek tragedy of the past. I'm going to take 2 more questions, then we have to move on or we won't finish yet.
I'm going to be the opposite. I'm thinking about Tikkun Olam as sort of a bridge here, that in fact we are bound to perform Tikkun Olam, and that is the first step of agency. We see something wrong and we have to deal with it. And how does that?
We're going to get there because that's really the idea of covenant. And that's where Rav Soloveitchik speaks about this idea. And I want to bring it into the Purim story as well. How do we fight against an Amalekian philosophy? And the answer is exactly what you said, is to fight against the idea of fate and to adopt an idea of agency, of destiny, and to do that through or tikkun olam or covenantal work with God. So I hope we'll answer that by the end of the class. Yeah.
If I understand this right, it seems that on national level, Soloveitchik offers 2 entry points to the covenant of destiny.
Yeah.
And also, and I guess for those who were not buying in on that level, they were buying in on the Zionist level.
So that's a very, very good question, because I don't want to get into it now because it's really more of an academic discussion. But the question is, does Rav Soloveitchik allow for this covenant of destiny to be applied to the idea of Zionism? Because the third part of the essay is all about Zionism, and therefore what's the link between the two? I don't want to get into it now, but yes, you're okay. Yeah.
My question, that was the question. From what I understand from the Sachs,
Yes.
that his chidush is that he offers that swath of people, Jews, a way to buy into this national destiny without necessarily being halachists or Zionists. Yes, no?
Sachs 100. Well, I would say Sachs also very, very well in his early writings for sure. In his later writings, maybe less so. And the more we get into them, the more you'll see he becomes much wider in his scope. Certainly in his early writings, traditional and untraditional age, the ones we saw right at the beginning, he still is very much aligned to and married to the concept of halakha as and orthodoxy as the sole orienting axiom through which we need to create this covenant of destiny. As he moves on, I think he widens the scope, but definitely at the beginning more so. And I think that's the influence of Rav Soloveitchik. As time goes on, he understands that he has to be more inclusivist. So I think it widens, but yeah. I mean, listen, also even for Rav Soloveitchik, what does Zionism mean? You know, it's not just halakha. So I think that there is an element of Zionism there within the covenant of destiny as well, for sure. Okay, so now let's move to the second part, and that is the idea of the Purim story. And I want to look now at the idea of Amalek. Amalek, and we don't have that much time. We have 20 minutes, so we're going to do it, you know, quite quickly. But I want us to understand exactly the notion that I'm trying to put forth here, and that is that Amalek and the whole Purim story is very much a movement from fate to destiny in Rav Soloveitchik's framing. Look at how where we meet Amalek. Yisu kol adat ben Yisrael mimidbasin lemaseh al pi Adonai v'yachnu b'refidim ve'ein mayim lishtot ha'am. V'yarev ha'am im Moshe v'yamru tnu lanu mayim v'nishteh v'yom lehem Moshe ma taru v'nimadim ma tinasun et Adonai v'yitzama sham ha'am lemayim v'yelen ha'am al Moshe v'yomer lama zeh halitinu mimitzrayim la'amit oti ve'et benai ve'et magnai b'tzama. Okay, so the people complained to Moshe. This is when they came out of Egypt. And they call to Moshe and they say, why we want to go back to Egypt? Why have you brought us out here to kill us with you know, by not giving us water? I'm going to skip. And they keep arguing with him. And eventually he brings them, he gets to a rock and he hits them. By the way, this is the precedent for later on. Here he's told to hit the rock. He hits the rock, water comes out. And look at Pasuk Zion. V'yikra Shem hamakom Masa Meriva al Rib b'nei Israel v'al nisotam et Adonai lemor. The place is called Masa Meriva because the people quarreled with God and tested him, saying, Hayesh Adonai b'kirbeinu im ayin. It's a very, very strange sentence, a very strange phrase. Is God b'kirbeinu is often translated among us, but really b'kirbeinu, the other time we see it in Torah, is when Sarah laughs bikirba. Remember when God says to her, you're going to have a child, and she laughs internally. Bikirbeinu really doesn't mean is God among us. Bikirbeinu means is God within us. Okay, it's going to be important. Im ayin, and im ayin here is really all is there nothingness. Okay, this is very much represents this idea of till now God has been revealing himself all the time. He revealed himself in Egypt, the Makot, then they go and then he splits the sea. All the time God is there. It's like that, like Winnicott's idea of the omnipotent mother. When the mother's there all the time, the minute the child cries, the mother offers the breast, and the child and the mother are one and the same thing. And all of a sudden when their mother disappears, the child starts crying. Why? Because the mother imagines that the child is part and parcel of the child. So there's a part of the child that's been lost as well. And the child doesn't understand that they're two separate components. They're two separate people. And he talks about this idea of disillusioning the child. And the child has to understand that the mother is not omnipotent, that the mother is and not omnipresent, that the mother isn't there all the time and isn't everything. And the child has to begin to understand that separation. In the same way here, the people are saying, where's God? And what they don't understand is that even when God externally cannot be seen and isn't present and isn't doing the miracles for them, God is actually within them. What does it mean to have Tselem Elokim? This was a radical idea in the Torah, and Rabbi Sachs again speaks about this a lot. The idea that we're created in the image of God, that actually there's a divine element with in each and every one of us, that we have the ability to, in the same way that God is free, in the same way that God takes agency, in the same way that God is creative, so can we be. And the people who are slaves, who are constantly compelled, who have lived a life of submission for so many years. At that moment, there's an element of them saying, we can't do anything. We need God to do all the miracles. We need God to do everything. And the reason why they fought was because what did they want? What did they want? They wanted water. What could they have done? They could looked for a well, tried to solve a solution on their own, tried to take agency of the situation. What do they do instead? They cry out to God because they want, like the child, that immediately they want the breath, they want the water. And God hits the rock and comes water. But the Torah very cleverly explains to us that that isn't the essence of the problem. The problem isn't that they complained. The problem is that they had no belief in themselves. And therefore, what happens immediately afterwards? Amalek. Immediately after comes Amalek. Look what happens. No, we'll get to it in a minute. Okay, so that's the first idea. Let's have a look at, for a second, what Amalek is, okay? Who Amalek is. Source number 2. Remember what Amalek did to you on the way when you came out of Egypt. That chanced upon you on the way. And he came with all the stragglers that were behind, all the weak people who were behind. He attacked, and you were tired and weary, and you didn't fear God. Okay, again, this is a whole nother discussion. God-fearing people would put the weak people ahead, would look after the weak people in the short or even in the middle. The weak people were at the end, they were behind. They were open to attack. Okay, what does it mean to be a God-fearer? And again, this is for a different time, but it's super important. Chance, fate. Why is chance and fate? So if you look in source number 3, a very, very interesting, comes from the Tochacha, comes from the rebuke that God says, if you do this, then this will happen to you. In Tachuimi Bekeri Velota Bulishmali, the Yasati Alechem Makash Sheva Chatatechem, Vishlachti Bechem Hayata Sadeh, Vishklautchem, Behrita Ebehemetechem, Behaimitautchem, Benashmu Darkechem. Okay, so God says to them, if you walk contrary to me, until Chuimi Keri, what does that mean? It's a very, very strange bitui. Look at the next pasuk. Chav Gimel ve'im be'eletot lotid siruli v'halachtem imi Keri v'halachti afani imchem beKeri. If you walk contrary to me, I'll walk contrary to you. But it doesn't really mean contrary. What do we know? What is Keri? Keri is a seminal emission. Okay, that is by a chance emission, okay, not during sexual intercourse, but just a chance emission. And for a chance emission, one has to go and purify oneself, whatever else. Keri is chance. If you walk with me per chance, I will walk with you per chance, says God. I'm not going to read the rest of it, but look at Chizkuni and Rashi and how they explain what this means. God says to them, if you walk with me, if you treat me, look at the translation, if you treat me as happenstance, right? Rabotenu amru arai. Arai literally means temporary. If you treat something just as happens as temporary, God is temporary, the world is temporary, everything is set to chance, right? Because Kuni says something even stronger. Nothing permanent, it's only fate. If the powers that govern the world, if we treat the world as fatalistic, and by the way, throughout the history of humanity, fatalism reigned on many occasions. Even the whole Greek mythology was very fatalistic. It was a mythology of tragedy. If one looks at mythology generally, and then later on we have this idea of fate, and even today, as I said to you, even in modernity, there's a very fatalistic outlook at the world. If we treat the world as fate, if we do not believe that there is something more, then God says, I will treat you in the same way. Okay, you will also be treated to fate. And what is the treatment of fate? Amalek. Amalek is the quintessential ideas, the quintessential character of fate. Okay, look at Esther. בחודש הראשון הוא חודש ניסן בשנת 12 למלך אחשוורוש, הפיל הוא הגורל לפני Haman. Okay, even the word that Rav Soloveitchik, a Brit Goral, right? On the first month of Nisan, the 12th year of King Achashverosh, they cast a pool allot, which was the Goral Lifnei Haman. Okay, Miyom Lechotesh, and we know Haman is the descendant of who? Of Amalek. Okay, Haman is the same outlook as Amalek. And the question is, how does one fight a fatalistic outlook? How does one fight an outlook in which I believe that There's two, the idea of fatalism has two prongs. One is the idea that it is what it is. The world is how it is. There's nothing we can do about it. And we are just, we're subject to the fate of the world, right? It's fate. That's how it is. The other prong is, what about us? What happens to us in such an outlook? To the individual, we become passive. We don't believe that we can do anything to change the reality of the situation. Why? Because it's fate. Amalek, very much that was the outlook of the world, and it is antithetical to the Jewish outlook. Why? Why is it, if we believe in divine providence and we believe that God is overseeing the way of the world, then why can't we just say, okay, it's another manifestation of fate? Number one, it's totally nihilistic, 100%. In such a world, there's no point in me doing anything that contains meaning. Why? Because I'm not going to be able to control anything, right? It becomes nihilistic. It becomes totally narcissistic, because ultimately I do what's good for me because I don't know what's going to be tomorrow. All of the corollaries of fatalism lead to a tragic outlook. That's why Greek philosophy or Greek mythology was tragic, because it leads to a tragic outlook. Judaism is a protest against such an outlook of the world. Judaism and the Bible in particular, Torah, yes, there is an element of fate in our existence, or what you want to call divine providence, or what you want to call certain conditions that we can't control. Okay. However, human beings are born into this world. We are created in the image of God. And what does it mean to be created in the image of God? It means that we are free. We are free. We are free human beings. We are able to determine the outcome of a situation. Teshuvah. Why are we told teshuvah, the idea of repentance? Why does that come before the creation of the world? Because without it, we can't be anything. Without the knowledge that we can change not just the future, but actually the past, because that's what teshuvah does, right? Is to change the narrative of the past. That only someone who is a free agent is able to do that. So how do we fight an Amalekian philosophy? And I would say even more so, how do we fight a philosophy that we don't have any belief in ourselves? Because what fatalism does is to negate any sense of human will and agency. And this is what God commands them to do. Immediately following the question, Hayesh Hashem b'kilbenu im ayin. And again, im ayin is the question of nihilism, of nothingness. Is there nothingness to our existence? Nothing in our existence? The way to fight that philosophy is in the following way. Look at source number 6. God says to them, you don't believe in yourselves. You don't believe that I'm within each and every one of you. I'm going to show you that you can fight a battle on your own. You don't need to just be people who rely on God and are totally and utterly dependent on the omniscient and omnipotent God. You can fight for yourself. I will stand on the top of the mountain and the stick of God will be in my hand. And Yoshua did what Moshe told him. Moshe, Aaron, V'chu alu rosh hagiva. Moshe, Aaron, and V'chu go to the top of the mountain. Moshe. When Moshe raised his hand, they were successful. When he put them down, they were defeated. The Yedei Moshe kvedim. And Moshe's hands were heavy. And he got a stone and put it underneath it. And on either side, he had people that supported him. And his hands were the hands of emunah. Now, again, emunah here is not in the classic way we think about faith as propositional faith. He believed in God. He believed X, Y, Z. No. Emunah here is the idea of trust. The idea of a covenantal relationship. When the people looked up to heaven, and we have Mishnah Rosh Hashanah tells us, did Moshe's hands make or break war? It's in the next source. They said, no, Moshe's hands didn't make or break war. There wasn't any miracle here. There wasn't any, superstitious kind of rendering. No, rather what when the people of Israel would look heavenwards and direct their hearts to Hashem, they would be victorious. And if they didn't, they wouldn't. Meaning what? The question that they asked, Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu, is answered in the battle of Amalek. If you believe in, you know, that beautiful saying, right? That Moda ani lefnecha Hashem melachai b'chem hichzata b'nishmati b'chemla rabba emunatecha. What do we say every morning? That God, in his compassion, believes in us. He gives us faith in ourselves. Emunatecha, your faith in yourself. When we believe that God is with us and we're working with God, then we have faith in our capabilities. If we believe we're created in the image of God with all the creative capacities that God has, then we have faith in our capacity to act in this world and to change the world and to do tikkun olam and to make it different than it is. And today, more than ever, we need that hope and belief and belief in ourselves and our capacity to make the world other than it is. More than ever, to believe that we're created in the image of God, to do that. And that is the way they fight Amalek. There's no miracle here. The miracle is that the people begin to believe in themselves because they work with God in covenant. And this is really this is a natural battle. This isn't a miraculous battle, not like God splitting the sea. By the way, even the idea of God splitting the sea, God says, Nachshon ben Aminadab, the midrash of Nachshon is that they go into the sea, that first they have to take the first step, right? But even that is perhaps more. Rav Shimshon Hirsch speaks about this idea. We don't have time to expand on all of this, but I want to show you source number 10, which is the Rambam. The Rambam says as follows: Moshe Rabbeinu knew all along that belief based on miracles leaves people weary and doubtful. And that was why he was so reluctant to accept the mission of going to Pharaoh. Now, Rambam goes even further than that. Rambam, and I haven't brought it for you, but Rambam speaks about the idea that the very essence of the fact that we are commanded, okay, the idea of being commanded means that we have to be free. Because what Rambam says, and by the way, Rambam preceded the Enlightenment philosophers that started speaking about the idea of freedom and throwing off the yoke of the church fathers and wanting religion and law and everything else to be coming from the autonomy of the individual. Rambam preceded them by 4 centuries, and he already said what they said, because the Rambam said, if one feels compelled or coerced to keep the law, there's no point them keeping the law. Rambam says that to really keep the law as you're meant to keep it, you have to keep it from the point of being a totally free person. That is destiny, not fate. Okay, that is when I choose willingly to be part of the Jewish people. And I want to show you that there is a moment in Megillat Esther. One second. Oh, I have it for you. Look at source number 15. Source number 15, if man's actions were done under compulsion, the commandments and prohibition of the law would be nullified, and they would also be absolutely in vain, since man would have no choice in what he does. The truth about which there is no doubt, that all of man's actions are given over to him. If he wishes to act as he does so, and if he does not wish to act as he does so, there is no compulsion whatsoever upon him. Hence, it necessarily follows that the commands can be given, says Rambam. If we are not free, we cannot be given the commands. The very fact that we are given the commands by God means that we are free individuals. It's an amazing statement, very revolutionary, especially in Rambam's time. And I want to show you where in Megillat Esther we move from covenant of fate, from an existence of fate to an existence of destiny. Now, I always ask myself this question: why is it called Megillat Esther? Why is it not called Megillat or Purim or Mordechai? Exactly. Why is it not called Megillat Mordechai? Mordechai really is the central person in the story. Mordechai is the one who stands up against Haman. And by the way, Haman again is very much that fatalistic idea that we have no control over our destiny. Mordechai, by standing up against Haman, what's she showing us? I am a free individual. I am not going to be compelled to do what everyone else is. I'm not going to conform to what everyone else is doing. I'm going to be individual. I'm going to be different. Mordechai is the one that misovev kol hasipur. He's the one that really is moving all of the players and all the stories here. So why is it called Megillah Esther? And I want to argue that there is one moment in the Megillah in which there is what we call, Thomas Kuhn calls a paradigm shift, right? There is a moment where everything turns around. And that happens in chapter 4. And I want to read it with you. Mordechai yada kol asher naseh. We don't have very, very long, but we're going to take 5 minutes extra this week. Mordechai yada kol asher naseh. ויקרא מרדכי בגדיו וילבש שק ואפר ויצא בתוך האב ויזעק זעקה גדולה ומרה. First and foremost, what do we see? We see that Mordechai understands that he cannot allow his people to go down with fate. First and foremost, he begins by changing his external reality. He tears his clothes, he puts sackcloth, and he goes and he screams and cries out. He understands that first and foremost, we have to do the external rituals, the external changes to begin to change the internal reality. ויעבוד שהמלך כי אין לבוא שהמלך בלבוש שק וכל המדינה מדינה במקום אשר דבר המלך וצור מגיע אבל גדול אבל גדול יודעים וצור מבכי מצוות שק ואפר יוצאו לרבים. Okay, so everywhere where the Jews were, people were crying, where people were putting on sackcloth. ותבואנה נערה אסתר ותעשה ויגידו לה ותחלחל המלכה מאוד. Again, a very interesting word which we see only, I think it's the only time in Tanakh that we see it. It's a very, very strange word, ותחלחל, and it literally comes from the word halal. All of a sudden, that vacuum that Esther's been covering, we all cover up that vacuum, that internal vacuum. All of a sudden, it becomes exposed. That halal, that place, that empty space, that identity, who am I? All those questions. And v'tishlach begadim l'halbish et Mordechai. She says, cover yourself up. Don't be a Jew. Don't shake things up. V'lo kibel, he didn't take it. And it continues on and on and on. And there's a conversation between them. And Mordechai says to Esther, go and you need to go to the king, right? And ask the king, say to the king that my people are under threat. If you look at Pasuk Gimel, ויאמר מרדכי להשיב אל אסתר, אל תדמי בנפשך. And Esther replies, I can't go, I haven't been called to him, right? I can't go, I can't do this. What has Esther, until this moment, Esther has been what? Passive, totally passive. Situations beyond her, seemingly, ostensibly beyond her control. She has been pulled from one situation to the other. She has been a pawn. She has very, very much been the object of fate. Everything has been outside of her control. And this moment, she says the same. She replies in a fatalistic way to Mordechai. I have not been called to the king. It reminds me of the story of Rabbi Sachs when he met the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe says, what are you doing in Cambridge? You know, he was a student in Cambridge at the time. What are you doing for Jewish life in Cambridge? And he says, well, the situation in which I find myself in, Rabbi Sachs replied, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe turns around, we don't find ourselves in a situation. We put ourselves into a situation. And this is the moment in which Mordechai says exactly the same sentence to Esther. You haven't found yourself in a situation. For some reason, you've been put into this situation. And now you need to change from an existence of fate to an existence of destiny. You need to understand that you're not just bound to your people through ties of fate. You're born Jewish, very nice. No, you're tied to your people through chains of destiny. And that means, maybe here we understand chains. Chains of destiny means what? It means I need to sacrifice for my people, right? What Heschel says, right? Freedom presupposes, something we've forgotten today, freedom presupposes sacrifice. I need to sacrifice my short-term gratification, my freedom, for something bigger. That's really what it means to be free. And at that moment, Esther realizes that the chains of destiny require her to do something big in which she's putting her life at risk. And what happens? Listen to what Mordechai first says. I'm on Pasuk Yud Gimel. V'yomer Mordechai lashiv el Esther. Al tidami b'nafshech limalet bet hamelech mikol haYehudim. Do not think that you will be hidden away in the king's house, that you're not going to have the same fate as the rest of the Jews. Again, it reminds us very much of the Holocaust, and that's what Rav Soloveitchik calls a covenant of fate. Ki im hacharesh tachrishi be'et hazot, revach v'hatzalam yamod liYehudim b'makom acher. If you are silent at this time, I promise you, there will be redemption for our people. Mordechai here believes that there will be redemption. He doesn't know where it's going to come from. And this is what he says. Fine, you'll be destroyed. Umi yodea. Says Mordechai, we are living in an existence whereby God is not coming. He's not showing himself openly to us. We don't know. We are living in a place of uncertainty. We do not know. Mi yodea, we don't know what's going to be. We don't know why the situation is the way it is. We don't know why it looks like fate. And that is the moment that Esther realizes she needs to assume the role of destiny. She says, go and gather all of the people, let them fast me, let them drink for me, and let them fast me, let them pray for me. And I understand now that to be part of a covenant of destiny means to sacrifice something for the bigger whole. If I lose, I lose. If I sacrifice, I sacrifice. This really is the moment in which Esther moves from a covenant and an existence of fate to a covenant and an existence of destiny. And that is why we call it Megillat Esther. What she does, and again, here I brought you many, many other sources about this idea of moving from fate and destiny, but I want to finish with Rabbi Sachs in source number 17. I want to say as follows. Before we get there, look at source 14. Source 14 is the very, very famous Agada in the Gemara that says that at the time of Matan Torah, God held the mountain over the heads of the people and said, either you accept the Torah or you'll be buried here. And therefore, really, was the Torah given in a free-willed, consensual way? No. When was the Torah given consensually or accepted consensually, says the rabbis at the generation of Achashverosh. Why? Because God didn't have the mountain over their heads. God's not in the Megillah. We don't see his name. We don't see him working the works of the Megillah. That's why when you read the Megillah, it has to be open. You have to fold it open. It has to be open because we have to see the whole picture. To see it only in parts, God's not there. But when we see the whole picture, we understand that he is. Okay, at the generation of Achashverosh is the one that accepted willingly because they understood what it is to act for God in a covenant of destiny, not just a covenant of fate, not just because you're born into it and you don't have a choice, but after the opposite, because you are making a free will choice to be part of your people and to not just that, but to actually have the mission of your people and take agency of that mission. And that's what the Megillah is all about. That is what the story is all about. And I'm going to finish with Rabbi Sachs. He says, if any story in the Bible tells us about the significance of Jewish smallness, it's this. To win the special battle in which you are engaged in, says God, you do not need numbers. You need commitment, passion, dedication to a cause. Precisely because you are outnumbered, every individual will know that he or she counts, that each Jew carries an immense responsibility of the fate of Judaism and the Jewish people. Zechariah put it best, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Almighty Lord. Physical strength needs numbers. The larger the nation, the more powerful it is. But when it comes to spiritual strength, you need not numbers, but a sense of responsibility. You need a people, each of whom knows that he or she must contribute something to the human heritage, leaving the world better than it would have been had they not existed. The Jewish question is not what can the world give me? It is what can I give to the world? The Jewish story is a story of responsibility. And in a sense, I would say that an existence of fate is an existence whereby I eschew my responsibility. And an existence of a destiny is an existence in which I take on responsibility. No Jew has lived Judaism can be without a social conscience. To be a Jew is to accept responsibility. The world will not get better of its own accord, nor will it make it a more human place by leaving it to others, to politicians, columnists, protesters, campaigners, making them our agents to bring redemption on our behalf. Judaism begins not with man's cry to God, but with God's cry to us, each of us, here and where we are. If you are silent at this time, says Mordechai to Esther, relief and deliverance will come from somewhere else. But who knows whether it is not for such a time as this you have attained royalty. To be a Jew is to be alert to the poverty, the suffering, the loneliness of others. That is the question Judaism poses to each of us. Yes, if we do not do it, someone else may. But we will then have failed to understand why we are here and what we are called upon to do. Judaism is God's greatest ever call to human responsibility. And that is the movement from fate to destiny. When I'll leave with the following thing. David Brooks in his book, The Second Mountain, says like this. He says, no one ever said that they got over the death of a child by going to Hawaii on holiday. However, people say that they had achieved some kind of cathartic redemption by giving back to society through the death, meaning creating amutot, creating memory, creating something in the memory, bringing good into the world. That is the difference. Fate happens to us. There are things, there is suffering, there are tragedies, there are terrible things that are beyond our control. The question is, how do I respond to it? Do I remain a passive individual in which I just let everything continue to happen around me, exactly as Esther was before she took the responsibility? Or do I understand that instead of focusing on the why, I need to ask, what does this summon me to do? Not why did it happen? We may not know, but what does this summon me to do? And when I move in my head from an existence of fate to an existence of destiny, when I understand that I am part of the Jewish people, not to just to be part of the Jewish people, but to be part of them for a reason, for a mission, for a purpose, for tikkun olam, for responsibility to the world, then I have achieved, according to Rav Soloveitchik, the movement from fate to destiny. That is what the Purim story is. And that's why, by the way, the Purim story for the rabbis is the moment in which we truly receive the Torah, because we receive it not coerced. We receive it as free human beings, where we have taken it upon ourselves and we go and take it towards a responsible place. With that, I finish. Wish you all a Purim Sameach. And next week, there's no class. Reminder, we will meet again in 2 weeks.